They're about to turn everything you know about our financial system on its head. That's right. One champion of digital assets at the White House is convinced that the United States could be just months away from unveiling a groundbreaking Bitcoin reserve that has the power to shake up the global economy. But how did we get here? And what exactly is boiling beneath the surface of Washington's corridors of power, where Senators Tim Scott and Cynthia Lummis are rallying behind new crypto regulations? President Trump's historic endorsement of Bitcoin still echoes in the background, and Bo Hines, yes, the White House's outspoken crypto advisor, claims the country is on the edge of a financial revolution. Today we're pulling back the curtain on all of it, diving headfirst into the swirl of big promises, hidden strategies, and high-stakes battles. Buckle up, because this wild ride is just getting started. Now, let's get one thing straight. The United States has dabbled in digital assets before. Plenty of agencies across the federal government have tested the waters, but the notion of a fully realized Bitcoin reserve changes the entire game. Are we staring down the barrel of a brand new era in which the US government is not merely regulating cryptocurrency, but actually hoarding it? And what does it mean if Washington decides to become an active participant in the Bitcoin economy rather than just a referee on the sidelines? In this deep dive, we're going to uncover how this idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve has evolved, why so many people are passionate about it or terrified by it, and whether it might actually come to fruition in the coming months. In this episode, we'll investigate three core angles. First, how the White House's top crypto voices, and specifically Bo Hines, navigate the swirling pressures to establish a digital asset reserve. Second, what the newly unveiled Genius Act could mean for the crypto landscape and America's plans to solidify Bitcoin in its own stockpiles. And third, how major political players, from President Trump to Senators Tim Scott and Cynthia Lummis, became entangled in this high-stakes narrative. Plus, we'll check out the biggest question on everyone's lips. Does the government actually want to buy up even more Bitcoin? And if so, how might it do so in budget-neutral ways, as Bo Hines so enigmatically put it? We will peel back the layers to reveal the intricate steps that have led to this turning point. From President Trump's surprising support for Bitcoin on the campaign trail to the wave of altcoins that once threatened to capture government interest. We'll explore how the altcoin debate ended up stirring more controversy than momentum, igniting pushback from the industry and voters alike, and compelling Washington to refocus primarily on Bitcoin. After all, Bitcoin's brand is titanic. It's recognized as the original cryptocurrency, the digital gold that so many nations are now eyeing. So, is this the beginning of an intense new era where countries race to amass as much Bitcoin as possible, jockeying for dominance in the future global economy? Sound intriguing? Good. It's about to get even more complicated. Because while the White House and certain senators champion a future anchored by Bitcoin, not everyone is on board. Inside the monumental Senate Banking Committee press conferences, there has been a tug-of-war between those who see a bold new advantage for America and those who treat the entire notion of a federally supported Bitcoin reserve as too risky to handle. Yet Bo Hines, now on the front lines as executive director of the Presidential Council of Advisors for Digital Assets, insists that the United States can't afford to stand still while other nations stockpile and experiment with digital weaponry of the financial kind. So, how do you consolidate Bitcoin holdings on a national scale? That, my friends, is where the real story begins. And it's also where the hush-hush side of the plan emerges. You won't see many people discussing the plan's details on mainstream news, but insiders say the White House has spent painstaking hours accounting for every Bitcoin fraction currently held by federal agencies. Think about that. Every digital wallet, every crypto stash uncovered during criminal investigations or seized from hackers, meticulously tallied and filed under top-secret classifications. According to Bo Hines, the government has officially completed that accounting. The next step? That's apparently the infrastructure phase, and this is where the big leaps happen. Hines has teased budget-neutral approaches, essentially creative means of feeding more Bitcoin into the U.S. inventory without rattling taxpayers. It all begs a million questions. Does budget-neutral mean new forms of seizing crypto from wrongdoing? Will the White House spark fresh controversies by relocating budget allocations from other sectors? Could there be a major reshuffling of federal funds that is about to occur, or has already begun in shadows and smoke-filled rooms? And as the government sets its sights on large-scale Bitcoin accumulation, are we about to see private markets quake at the prospect of giant institutional buy-ins? These are exactly the tricky, tension-laden scenarios fueling arguments both for and against the reserve concept. To keep your eyes on the prize, the impetus for creating a national stockpile of Bitcoin is grounded not only in the belief that Bitcoin could blossom into the digital gold of the 21st century, but also in the fear that, if the US doesn't act swiftly, another global power might. It's reminiscent of the nuclear arms race mentality, but the battlefield is purely digital: currencies, blockchains, and code. We'll parse what Tim Scott's and Cynthia Lummis' recent statements signal about Capitol Hill's readiness to accelerate legislation. After all, these two senators have become figureheads of pro-crypto policy, rallying behind new acts like the Genius Act, which could rewrite the rules for how digital assets are regulated and recognized within the national economy. Before we push any deeper, let me hit you with a short request. If you find this unraveling of government secrets, high-stakes economic strategy, and behind-the-scenes deals as fascinating as I do, go ahead and show some love. It's the perfect moment to lend a hand by clicking that like button, or letting a friend know about this deep dive. Believe me, the more we band together around these big revelations, the more they come to light. All right, so back to the story at hand. Some critics have pointed out that, historically, every time the federal government attempts to structure a reserve of anything, from oil to gold, the inevitable bureaucracy sets in, with countless committees, subcommittees, and oversight boards piling on. Could the same bureaucratic quagmire hamper this initiative? Or has Washington grown nimble enough to handle a rapid-pace environment like crypto? Bo Hines suggests the latter, painting a fairly optimistic picture of how quickly the consolidation can move. But Hines is, after all, at the center of the push. Critics stress that his assurances might be more aspirational than guaranteed. We also have to consider the prior fiasco involving the altcoin-heavy composition initially proposed. When President Trump floated the idea of a more diverse digital asset reserve, especially including certain altcoins, it ignited a political and industry-based backlash. Some altcoins soared on speculation that they might be the darlings of federal acquisition, while others quickly fell under harsh scrutiny once it became clear that not all digital tokens would stand on equal footing. Worse, a chunk of the public felt that the federal government was meddling in markets and picking winners. The controversy got so loud that the administration pumped the brakes. Now that the noise has subsided, we have the Senate Banking Committee re-emerging with a new vision, presumably anchored by Bitcoin rather than a chaotic mix of digital assets. Speaking of the Senate Banking Committee, the press conference that confirmed these updates was described by insiders as primarily a battle over the future regulatory frameworks. Senators Tim Scott and Cynthia Lummis, forging a powerful alliance, hammered home the necessity for clearer rules to protect consumers, stimulate innovation, and position the U.S. as a leader in the digital asset realm. Meanwhile, a cluster of more skeptical senators expressed alarm over how resource-intensive Bitcoin mining can be, or how volatile the crypto market is, especially in turbulent global times. Are such concerns valid? Absolutely. Will they be enough to derail the process of forming a national Bitcoin reserve? That remains very much up in the air. Within the hype, you will find some pockets of growing anxiety among traditional financial institutions, particularly those that have an interest in upholding the status quo. They fear that a large-scale shift toward crypto signals that fiat currency might eventually see decreased dominance, or that big banks could lose their stranglehold on certain forms of economic influence. On the flip side, pro-Bitcoin advocates see the government stepping in as a major legitimizing force for an industry that has long struggled with credibility. If the U.S. government indeed proves it is stacking up Bitcoin, cynics might finally stop labeling digital currencies as mere speculation or hype. But let's turn the spotlight back onto the major cast of characters shaping this narrative. We have Bo Hines, sometimes perceived as a maverick for even suggesting a massive government pivot toward Bitcoin. Then we have Tim Scott and Cynthia Lummis, who for quite some time have championed crypto-friendly legislation in the Senate, culminating in the development of the Genius Act. Of course, we can't omit President Trump's earlier tenure, during which his willingness to vocally support Bitcoin raised eyebrows. Yes, his initial move was also overshadowed by pushback, especially with that altcoin fiasco, but it was a moment that signaled a dramatic shift in how the highest elected offices might perceive digital currencies. In fact, it's worth revisiting the day Trump first campaigned on Bitcoin. The sheer shock on the faces of career politicians said everything. It was an uncharted territory for an American president to weigh in on an emerging decentralized form of money. That moment arguably planted the seed we're watching grow now, a notion that the federal government shouldn't just regulate digital assets, but also incorporate them into strategic holdings. And while many of his prior supporters are still figuring out how they feel about Bitcoin, the conceptual momentum has not dissipated. To move forward, we have to highlight the practical steps. Bo Hines recently stated that the actual infrastructure behind the reserve is the next big hurdle. Word from behind the scenes suggests that might involve specialized custodial systems to lock away the government's digital holdings with rigorous security, but it could also spread into how exactly the U.S. might accumulate more Bitcoin. We already know from various reports that law enforcement agencies have seized large amounts of cryptocurrency from criminals over the past several years. If those wallets had been lying dormant, imagine the potential impetus to centralize them now. Then there's the possibility of earning yields on certain blockchain protocols, though no one seems eager to publicly confirm that. And with the push toward budget neutrality, it might be that the government is exploring strategic partnerships with private firms or seeking novel means for swapping less used assets for Bitcoin. One dimension we absolutely must not overlook is how the global scene might react. If the United States starts open discussions about building a substantial Bitcoin reserve, other nations might fast-track their own crypto acquisition plans. Some countries have already flirted with the idea of adopting Bitcoin as legal tender. While the U.S. might not be going that far, becoming a major holder of BTC definitely shifts the conversation about who truly holds power in the digital era. In essence, the main question is whether the U.S. is positioning itself for an inevitable future in which Bitcoin's role in global trade and finance is dramatically larger. And let's not forget the continuing battle over regulation, particularly the pieces of legislation, such as the Genius Act, that are swirling around. Some say that unless Congress passes new rules clarifying how digital assets are treated, we'll be stuck in limbo. We've heard from longtime critics who label crypto as a bubble or a fad, and they want thorough consumer protections before the federal government invests billions in a digital coin. Meanwhile, proponents claim such caution is letting other countries surge ahead in innovation. They say the delicate balancing act of regulation must be done quickly, so we can harness crypto's benefits without suffocating it in endless red tape. The government, too, may be mindful that average Americans and state institutions are already exploring their own reserves. In some states, local governments express interest in using leftover budget surpluses to snag Bitcoin while prices are comparatively low. Corporations, too, keep announcing that they are building up their reserves. In other words, if the feds drag their feet, they risk letting scattered pockets of the country outrun them. And that's a political narrative nobody in Washington wants to face when re-election time comes along. As such, Tim Scott and Cynthia Lummis have an incentive to push the national conversation forward, painting a vision of a unified approach to capturing the benefits of Bitcoin. This, of course, leads us to the question that keeps popping up. Are we on the cusp of a new gold rush? Except this time it's digital gold. The analogy feels more apt by the day. If a wave of national governments, including the U.S., begin loading up on Bitcoin, the ripple effects could be astronomical, especially for market prices, business innovation, and even the direction of monetary policy. The White House may have to reevaluate inflation strategies if it ties part of the national economic future to something as famously deflationary as Bitcoin. And it's no secret that across the globe, countries that accumulate strategic gold reserves do so to hedge against inflation. Now, in the digital age, Bitcoin might offer that same hedge, giving the U.S. a new arrow in its economic quiver. However, doubters abound. Are we absolutely certain that Bitcoin is stable enough to serve as a cornerstone asset for a government as sprawling and complex as the U.S.? In the crypto space, volatility is constant. Past bull runs have soared Bitcoin to record highs, only for it to crash about halfway back down in the following months. Could the federal government stomach such dramatic swings? Senators pushing the plan seem to believe so, arguing that, over longer time horizons, Bitcoin's general upward trajectory far outweighs the dips. Bo Hines himself has hammered on that point, that short-term volatility is an acceptable risk, given the potential for long-term strategic gains. But it remains to be seen whether the majority of policymakers are bold enough to join him. Now, I want to pause for just a second for a second invitation that might resonate with those of you enthralled by this collision of politics, economy, and technology. Consider subscribing or sharing this story with a friend who might also get a kick out of these behind-the-scenes details. Keeping these conversations alive ensures that crucial updates and fascinating revelations continue to surface in the public sphere. Let's continue to unravel the tensions swirling around the legislative battlefield of the Genius Act, which so many see as the legal keystone for a future Bitcoin reserve. Officially, it stands for Government-Endorsed Nationwide Infrastructure for Unified Systems, or at least that's what the rumor mill claims. The Act's proposed outlines are set to define how digital assets are taxed, how they can be used in cross-border transactions, and the extent to which states can set their own rules versus abiding by a new federal standard. Its supporters argue that once the Act passes, the U.S. can streamline everything from regulation to enforcement, bridging the gap between existing anti-money laundering laws and the unique aspects of crypto transactions. As the bill meanders through committees, the country looks on. Even beyond the halls of Washington, crypto enthusiasts and mainstream citizens alike wonder if this is the final ingredient needed to push the U.S. to declare itself not just a cautious spectator, but a major stakeholder in the digital frontier. On that note, we also must remember that implementing a national Bitcoin reserve is more than a single decision. It might require buy-in from the Department of the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and quite possibly a new or repurposed agency dedicated exclusively to digital assets. That's a lot of moving parts to align into one cohesive operation. So, why should you, an everyday observer, care about this? Admittedly, it might seem academic or sensational, something best left to politicians and finance moguls. But if the U.S. truly does dive headlong into establishing a significant Bitcoin reserve, that choice might reshape your financial reality, whether it's the stability of the dollar, the direction of inflation, or even opportunities for new crypto-based services. If the federal government invests heavily, expect big banks and major corporations to follow suit. Expect more capital from international investors. Expect a wave of new businesses building tools and infrastructure for a giant digital transformation. This story is not just about obscure political maneuvering, it's about the potential dawn of a new chapter in human economics. But we're absolutely still in the early days. Even if the White House has tallied up the existing store of BTC seized at the federal level, no official word has detailed how large that stash is. Bo Hines' statement from the press conference about establishing reserve infrastructure and accumulation leaves plenty of open questions. Could we see the White House quietly, or not so quietly, purchasing Bitcoin on the open market, much like companies do when they decide to add BTC to their balance sheets? Will that drive up the token's price, causing a frenzy of speculation? We also have to keep an eye on the potential for other major crypto updates overshadowing the reserve conversation. Some House representatives are working on legislation that could hamper or slow down adoption if they impose heavy-handed rules. Meanwhile, regulatory agencies like the Securities and Exchange Commission remain watchful about fraudulent activities or unscrupulous organizations fueling hype. Tim Scott, Cynthia Lummis, and their allies in Congress must navigate these shark-infested waters with great care, ensuring they don't spook the markets even as they attempt to bring more clarity and confidence to them. For us as spectators, it's an interesting moment in time. Only a few short years ago, the idea of the U.S. government endorsing Bitcoin so explicitly would have sounded like science fiction. People remember the days when high-ranking officials seemed uneasy about cryptocurrency's disruptiveness. Now, we have press conferences with boisterous claims about forging a new path and planning for digital gold. If anything, that alone signals how fast the tides can shift in the crypto sphere. The question of how soon we might see an official unveiling of the Bitcoin reserve remains up in the air. Skeptics say it could take many more years to navigate all the red tape, while optimists note that once the White House and key Senate figures align, events can move with surprising velocity. The impetus to remain competitive on a global scale, along with the sense that Bitcoin is becoming the future standard, might well accelerate the timeline. But as we know, in the realm of politics, everything moves at the speed of deals, alliances, and the occasional stroke of an executive pen. Perhaps tomorrow, a single statement from the president or from Bo Hines himself could galvanize the entire plan into the fast lane. Horse trading, backdoor negotiations, legal complexities, ideological battles. These are the ingredients to a dramatic shift in monetary policy that we might be living through if Washington stays the course. The big winners, if all goes smoothly, could be average citizens who benefit from a robust, future-oriented policy. Of course, there's no guarantee that crypto is the silver bullet for any economic woes. Some worry about potential future hacking attempts on government wallets, or the possibility that Bitcoin's price might slump at the very moment the government finalizes a bidding spree. But in every big move, especially one at a national scale, risk is simply part of the equation. As we wrap up this deep dive into the near future, it's clear that the government's hush-hush project of building a Bitcoin reserve is more than rumor. It's a carefully designed enterprise with outspoken advocates and intense critics. We've seen the sparks fly in the Senate. We've heard White House crypto advisor Bo Hines extolling what could be a generational opportunity. And we know that behind closed doors, the tallies of seized BTC and the quest for new avenues of acquisition continue. Could the U.S. tip the scales of the global economy by securing a massive slice of the Bitcoin pie? Or will internal divisions, regulation hurdles, and the famously unpredictable crypto market stall these epic plans? Either way, you're living in a pivotal period of transformation, where what was once the domain of pioneering tech enthusiasts and small retail investors is now becoming a central focus of the world's largest economy. Keep watching, keep questioning, because the final outcome here will likely reshape the story of money in the coming decades. One tender step or one bold leap. Which path will the government choose? Whatever the case, the ground is shifting beneath our feet at breakneck speed, and no one standing in Washington's marbled halls can afford to ignore it.